But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can't. But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can't. But I can't.
But I can't.
But I can.
I'm so glad that you have joined us today for the third part of our series, I Can. A series in which we are looking at some of the excuses that Moses made when God called him to do big work for him. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, but I want to share a story of my own life. I never had stage fright. I know they say the number one fear in the world, the number one phobia is being in front of other people, right? But if you've seen my daughter Abigail, who's 4 years old, and put her on a stage, it's like she was born to be on it. She just loves it for some reason. I always used to love it as well. And since I was little, I used to sing and I used to do poetry and all kinds of stuff on stages, and I never had an issue. Until one day in 2004, the year after I finished high school, something happened. I wanted to take part in an Afrikaans songwriting competition, and I wrote 2 songs that I had to go and perform again in front of very well-known South African singers, and a lot of well-known South African singers came out of this competition called Crescendo. And I went there and I'm my normal confident self, and then when I had to go to the back of the stage, there's not even a crowd, there's like a couple of judges sitting there. Suddenly I started like shaking. My fingers are shaking. I'm like, what is going on? Like, I need to play guitar, but literally my fingers cannot play the chords because they are moving. And for the first time in my life, I experienced something like that. And I asked myself, what is the difference between the previous times and this time when I started shaking, when I experienced stage fright? And what I thought about is this was the first time, not that I've been on a stage, but this is the first time that I would bring my own music, stuff that comes from my own heart, stuff that I created, stuff that I value. It would be the first time that I have to bring it in front of other people and be judged on that. See, if I was on a stage and someone didn't like a song that I sang that was written by someone else, it's their problem, right? It's like, blame the writer of the music. That's not on me. But if I sing my own song and someone says it's not good enough, that affects me. That touches my heart. If they rejected my music, they rejected me. And the same thing can happen in our everyday lives, whether that's in friendship and work or even in our faith, where we often wonder, do I have enough to offer? Is what I'm offering to people good enough that they would give me the thumbs up rather than the thumbs down? Would they say your music or your friendship or your love or whatever is valued, it is enough? Or are they going to say we do not appreciate it, it is not enough? And what is sad to me is just that fear of facing rejection, the fear of hearing that what you're doing is not enough, often traps us in a comfort zone, in a place where we want to avoid the risk and we want to stay in a place where it's safe, where I don't have to hear that I'm not enough. And today, this is the topic that we're going to be looking at. The third excuse that we're talking about in this series is, but I don't have enough to offer. I don't have enough to bring to the table. I don't have enough to offer. And let me give you a bit of background about the man that we're reading about in this series, a man named Moses. He was a Hebrew boy that grew up as a slave in Egypt. The Pharaoh wanted to kill all of the little babies because the Hebrews were growing too fast. That would later become the Israelites. And his mom made a plan, put him on the river where the Pharaoh's daughter found him, and then they offered to raise him. His own mom offered to raise her own son to the Pharaoh's daughter, but she didn't know this. So he grew up as a little Hebrew boy. At a certain age, he went to Pharaoh's palace, and he grew up there. And then finally, when he was 40 years old, he killed an Egyptian soldier after he saw how they abused the Hebrew slaves. And he had to run for his life. The Pharaoh wanted to kill him. So he went to a little nowhere town in the middle of the desert where we started looking after sheep. And finally found a wife that he got married to. And that was kind of like where he settled. It was comfortable. And then God appeared to Moses in a burning bush. A bush in the middle of the mountain that's burning. It's not burning out. And a voice speaking to him out of this bush. Initially, he was a little bewildered, but later he started listening to God. And then God says, Moses, I have an incredible task for you. I want you to go back and I want you to go and tell the people that I want to save them. I want you to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt so that they would become the Israelite nation in a new promised land. And then Moses starts making excuses. And if you've been reading along, we've got this challenge during this series to read some of the chapters in Exodus. So the first week we read chapter 1 to 3, last week chapter 4 to 6. This week we'll be reading chapter 7 to 9. So you will start going into this place where he's in front of the Pharaoh. But that gives you a great opportunity to learn the story. So I want to encourage you again to go 3 chapters this week that you have to read, Exodus chapter 7 to 9. But we will be today in Exodus 4, verse 1 to 8. So in Exodus 4, God already asked him to go. He's already made 2 excuses. And here comes number 3. After God just answered him. If you missed that, you can go and listen last week what happened. But in chapter 4, it starts, Moses answered God. What if, you can add the word but in there, but what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say that the Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, what is in your hand, Moses? And he replied, a staff. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out, he took hold of the snake and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. And God said, now put it back in your cloak. And Moses put his hand back in his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. Moses was asked by God to live for a greater purpose than just himself. To change the world, literally change the world of the Hebrew slaves. To help them to find freedom, to help them to become a nation, to help them to find their own land. God has this incredible job for him. God calls him into a relationship that very few people thought was possible, and that's to really walk with God, to be close to God. And it's this amazing challenge before Moses, and he keeps making excuses. And what's sad to me is if you read God's answer with the excuse that Moses is making in this third excuse, what I get to is that Moses, I think, believed that he didn't have enough convincing power or enough leadership skill or enough spiritual authority for people to actually follow him. He was afraid of failure. He's like, what if I go to them and they reject me? What if they say, we don't want to follow you, you're no one's leader, or no, you haven't heard from God? What if I go and what I have to offer is not enough? He felt God was probably asking a little too much of him. You'll see as we progress as well. He's like, God, you're asking way too much. He was pretty happy and in this comfort zone of living in this small town, taking care of his sheep and being married to his wife. He's like, I'm fine with that. I don't necessarily need to step out of this place of comfort. And instead of seeing this incredible opportunity that God is literally handing Moses on a platter, all he could see was God was making too great of an ask. And it's something that we all actually do. Let me sketch a scenario. What if every single day, just someone, government, a rich person, gives you 86,400 cents every day? What would you do with it? What potential would you see in it? Okay, so let me make that simpler. That is $864 a day. Or in a week, you will earn $6,048. Or in a year, that's $314K. What potential is there in it? Maybe you go like, oh, I'm earning like $300K a year. I'm just going to hide it under my mattress. Or maybe you're like, no, I want to do something better. I'm going to invest it in a bank. Or maybe you're like, no, I'm actually going to do a proper investment. Or you know what? That new car that I really wanted, I'm going to get one every year. Or maybe you're like, I'm going to buy my dream house. Or I'm going to stop working so hard at just cooking the whole day. I'm going to buy takeout once a day. Or maybe it's like, I'm going to start feeding the hungry. I've always wanted to do it. I never stepped up. Now I'm going to start feeding the hungry. Or maybe you think like, I'm going to start fostering a child because now I've got extra capacity. Or you start thinking about maybe being generous. Here is the thing. If you can see some incredible potential in 86,400 cents every day, let me tell you what we all have in common. Every single one of us gets 86,400 seconds per day. No one has more, no one has less. We all have the same amount of seconds. And each day, each of those seconds is also filled with incredible potential. But the question is, what do we do with it? Do we see the potential in the time that we have, or are we afraid of a big ask? Moses didn't want to leave his new home. He didn't want to do something uncertain with these 86,400 seconds. He was comfortable just using it for everyday stuff. And what is sad to me is that God called him so specifically to live a life of higher purpose. But this is not just something that happened to Moses because he's hearing a voice out of a burning bush. God calls each one of us to live for a higher purpose. God calls each one of us to announce freedom to a world that is suffering in bondage that doesn't know Jesus. He's asking each one of us to establish a new form of community called the church. He's asking each one of us to not just know about Jesus, but to journey with him. The same ask that he gave to Moses, we all have. But the problem is, I think one of the reasons that we don't step out of our comfort zones and actively start participating in the mission of our King is that we either believe we do not have enough to offer. Like, what do I have to offer God? Or we are just too comfortable with where we're at, and we're not willing to step out of that to live God's purpose. But let me tell you something. Comfort, your level of comfort, especially in the developed world, will always make you believe that you don't have enough. Always. Because when we think about our comfort, we're always looking at other people that we believe have a more comfortable lifestyle. So I'm always measuring upwards, and I'm like, oh, I'm not at that level. I don't have that much free time. Like, my children aren't old enough now, or my children aren't out of the house, or I'm not retired, or I'm not earning enough money. But comfort will always make you believe that there's not enough. You won't have enough to give to God with a tithe, with 10%. You won't have enough time to serve. You won't have enough capacity to lead. It will tell you that you cannot care for more people than you're actually caring for at the moment. It will tell you maybe that you cannot walk with Jesus because you don't have enough to offer him. But comfort will make you believe a lie. And let me tell you a truth quickly. No matter where you fall on the spectrum, just when we talk about physical resources, no matter where you fall on the spectrum between the have-nots and the people who do have, whether you're on the low side or the high side, that has nothing to do with whether we step into the plan that God has for us, whether we're going to be generous, whether we're going to take care of people, whether we're going to follow Jesus. What determines that is our mindset or a heart perspective. See, sadly to me, a lot of people live with a scarcity mindset instead of an abundance mindset. And let me define it for you. This is not a biblical term, but I think it is so cool to just like view it from a different perspective. An abundance mindset is when you believe there are plenty of resources to go about. What I have is more than enough to actually make a difference in the world. A scarcity mindset is when you believe that resources are limited. If my time, if my money, if my stuff, if any of that flows out of me, there won't be enough for me to have. And what is interesting, this is what psychology says. Scarcity mindset causes hyperfixation. So you become fixated on something. It leads to short-term coping. That's what Moses is trying to do. I'm just trying to cope with this burning bush in front of me, so I'm saying no. I don't even see the long-term picture, right? It leads to short-term coping instead of long-term problem solving. It increases jealousy and stress. Like, I don't know, generosity or following Jesus can decrease stress. Yes, it can. An abundant mindset, here's the interesting thing about people with abundant mindset. They advocate for collaboration. I don't want to be on my own. This is not about individualism. I want to be part of this community. I want to work with people to achieve something greater. I'm not going to lose something. They practice gratitude. People who feel like there's more than enough to go around, no matter where they are on that spectrum, they are more grateful. They notice automatic thoughts and give when they can. God could have said to Moses, because Moses definitely had a scarcity mindset. And God could have said to Moses, pull up your socks and get moving. Because if you don't go to those Israelites, to those Hebrews, I'm going to hit you with a lightning bolt. Right? Like, he's looking at a burning bush. I'm like, come on. Like, or you're going to be set on fire. Like, God could have done that. Could have said, I do not care about what you think. Like, this is what I'm telling you, and you will do it. But God's answer is so beautiful. And instead of showing Moses that he actually was good to go, or instead of directly answering Moses' objection, what God is doing is God is showing Moses something incredible, and that is that with God on his side, no matter where he thinks he falls on the spectrum, he will always be more than enough. Look at verse 2-3, where God tells him about the staff, and then again when we get to his hand part in verse 6-7. God asks him, this is God's initial response to his question. God tells him, Moses, what is in your hand? Like, what does that have to do with leading the Israelites? It's a staff. Okay, now this could have been used for one of two things. Back in those days, like they didn't lead sheep the way we do today or gather them that way. The shepherd will walk in front and the sheep will all follow. And they had those long staffs with the little hook at the top. So then when a little lamb wanders off, they could grab him and pull him back. So it could have been a simple herding staff. It could have been just a staff, a walking stick to walk with, because guess how old Moses is at this point when God called him? 80 years old. The Bible teaches that Moses was 40 when he killed. So he grew up in Pharaoh's palace till he was about 40 years old. He was 40 years old when he killed that soldier. And then the Bible says, and then 40 years elapsed before he sees the burning bush. So he's 80. And by the way, just for those who are a little worried that he's never going to say okay, he's still 80 when he appears in front of the Pharaoh. So he actually did get going fairly quickly. But God says, what is in your hand? God didn't ask him for something he didn't have. God didn't say, Moses, I want your youth. He wasn't a youthful man anymore. He was 80 years old. God didn't say, Moses, I want the crown of a prince. He wasn't a prince anymore. God didn't say, I want the army or the power or the money of someone that comes from royalty. God asked, what do you have? And this is a pattern, by the way, that appears over and over in the Bible. Elisha, a prophet that we read about, that lived many years later, gets to meets this poor widow who had nothing left to give, and she's on the point of dying. She's got a little bit of oil, and she's like, then it's done. Then we've got nothing more. And they ask her, what do you have? She's like, I told you, I have nothing. And he's like, what do you have? She's like, I've got a bit of oil. And God turned that oil, that little tiny amount of oil, into a never-ending stream of oil so that she could live. We read about a time when Jesus was preaching to thousands of people. Thousands, 5,000 men alone, and people are hungry. Guess what? There's no Chick-fil-A, no KFC, no nothing nearby. So Jesus says, how are we going to feed them? They're like, Jesus, we can never take care of everyone here. And a little boy comes with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Seriously, like, why are you even here with 5 loaves and 2 fish where there's thousands of people? God didn't ask how much he's bringing. God just asked, what is in your hand? Jesus was one day sitting and watching the offering buckets at the temple and how people went by, and some people came and they put in huge amounts of money, and this little widow came and she put in 2 copper coins, and Jesus said, did you just see that? Like, yes, the one who gave the little amount. She's like, yes, she gave more than everyone else because she gave what she had. The rest just gave out of an abundance. They didn't really even feel it. This is a pattern that reoccurs in the Bible. And I'm like, if I was Moses, I would have said, God, what does a staff, seriously, what does it have to do with leading people out of Israel? And often we struggle to entrust what we have to God because we compare ourselves to others. But let me tell you something today. We do not all have the same thing to offer God. But we all have something. You do not have the same gifts, the same talents, the same things as I do, and I do not have the same ones you have. But we all have something to bring to the table. And God is not asking you to bring something that you don't have. He's asking, what do you have in your hand? Do you have a broom in your hand? Do you have a brush in your hand? What about an instrument or a pen or maybe a tool, or maybe you've got money in your hand, or time or skills or talents or knowledge, or maybe it is just 86,400 seconds, but you've got something in your hand and God is asking you, what do you have? God does not ask for what you do not have. He asks us to be faithful with what we have. And what is so beautiful to me is God takes our ordinary, whether it's your brush, whether it's your voice, whether it is your money, whether it's your testimony, He takes our ordinary and He turns it into something extraordinary. That staff turned into a snake when Moses gave it to God. Like, that's pretty cool. Let me tell you what else happened with that simple staff. A staff that was used to either bring some lost sheep back, or a staff that was just used to keep an old man of 80 years from not falling over. But that staff, in Exodus 7 verse 20, he strikes the Nile River with it and the whole thing turns into blood. In 9 verse 23, he just points it to him and hail and thunder and lightning starts pouring down. In Exodus 10 verse 13, it brought winds and locusts. In Exodus 14 verse 16, it divided the Red Sea. In Exodus 17 verse 6, he struck a rock with it and water started pouring out of a rock. In Exodus 17 verse 9, that staff was kept in the air and a whole war was won. A simple, ordinary staff. You see, when we offer to God what we have, what He asks of us, He just multiplies the impact of what we give Him. And it's not for our sake. Okay, He didn't do all of that with that staff so that Moses could be a famous guy. He actually says why He's doing this. In verse 5, He says, okay, we've done the snake thing. Why? He says in verse 5, so that they may believe. You see, God does great things with what we have for His glory. And you and I will never know our full potential of what can be done with our simple lives until the moment that we hand it over to God. Let me say it a different way. You will never know the full potential of your life, of your skills, of your money, of your time, of your voice, until you are willing to offer it to God. What can God do with your 86,400 seconds? What can God do with your faithful tithe, your offering to Him? What can He do with your brush or with your instrument or with your tool? What can He do with your voice or your testimony? What can God do with your leadership skill or your hospitality or your experience? You see, what happens... Now let me ask it differently. What will happen if the capital C Church, what will happen if Grace Church, if all of us were willing to bring what we have in our hands to the table and say, God, use this and multiply it for your glory? But we struggle with that. Do you know why? Because we live like this. We live tight-fisted. And God told Moses, you have to be willing to let go of what you're holding so tightly to before I can do something with it. He said in verse 3, throw that staff down. Later he says, take your hand and put it in your jacket. Why didn't the staff just turn into a snake in his hand? I think that would have been a great illustration. Standing and it's like, right? His hand could have just why did he have to put it under his cloak to turn leprous? That wasn't necessary. It wasn't a necessary step. But God asked him, throw down your staff, put your hand in your coat. And Moses could have made excuses again. God, I'm an old man. How am I supposed to stand? What am I going to do if my sheep wanders away? But Moses actually decided to entrust it to God. He opened his hand. He let the staff drop to the floor. He put his hand in his cloak. And God uses what we're willing to give. He said, this is something I don't want. This is for you if you call yourself a Christian. I do not want you to think that just because the grace of Jesus is free, I do not want you to believe that it's cheap. Jesus paid with his life for it. And Jesus said if we truly want to follow him, it is not just about saying it or sitting in a seat on a Sunday. Jesus said you must lay down. You must be willing to lay down your life. To not just open your hand for one thing that you're comfortable with, but to give your whole life. He never expects of us what he won't do himself. He literally laid down his life for us on that cross. See, but we will need to be willing to give up our comfort, to give up our security, to face our fears, to face our lack of confidence, to face our scarcity mindset and say, how can I open my hands with what I have so that God can do something with it? And there is a reason why Jesus was so serious about this. Jesus spoke about that simple fact a lot in the New Testament. And you know why I believe Jesus was so serious? Because I believe that God doesn't truly have you until he has what is in your hands. It's easy to say with our mouth that we follow him. It's easy to attend church and to say that means I follow him. It's a different story to follow him with our hands and with our feet and with our stuff and with our time. And Jesus said something interesting in Matthew 6 verse 21. He said, where your treasure is, your heart will be. You see, Jesus understood that there is a direct correlation between what we have in our hands and what is in our heart. And often our hands follow what's in our heart, and sometimes our hearts follows what's in our hands. But the two is forever connected. We cannot say that we follow Jesus, but we're not willing to actually follow him. There was a rich young man in Luke 18, and those in small groups, you're actually going to read about him this week. A rich young man that said, Jesus, what will it take to follow you? And Jesus said, give all your money away. Did you know that Jesus didn't say that to everyone he encountered? He said it to that one man because Jesus knew that more than anything else, his comfort is in his money. Does God have a portion of your 86,400 seconds? Or are you too busy with your personal life and your own stuff and your challenges and your scarcity mindset to have time for God? I look at the Canadian church as an outsider, and after 16, 18 months, more as an insider as well. And I believe that the church in Canada is rapidly dying because we're starving ourselves. The church is starving itself because it's holding so tightly onto what they have. As numbers started to dwindle, as people struggled to pay upkeep for buildings, what we did is we started building as churches fortresses around us to say, keep the enemy out and keep us safe, and put everything in here and let's keep it here, because there's scarcity, guys. If we don't protect what we have, we'll run on empty soon. But what we didn't realize is when the walls are built and when the doors are closed, we are starving ourselves. And let me tell you why I believe Grace Church is growing, is because we have decided to put down the gates and to start tearing down the walls. There was a vision for the future that God offered Moses. God said, Moses, if you're just willing to open your hand, if you're willing to follow, you're going to lead the Hebrew people to freedom. You're going to lead them to a new land. And there is a promise for a future for us as well. Can we truly see people in our communities find freedom in Jesus? Can we see in our future lines of people waiting to be baptized because they found Him? Can we see a church that's impacting our community for the good? Can we imagine how it's possible to reach 1% of our community in the next 5 to 10 years? I can. I think the answer is yes, and I don't think it's that hard, but we need to be willing to entrust what we have to God. And when we are willing to say, God, all I have is this staff, but I'm willing to give this to you, what happens when I start being faithful with what He asks of me, something starts to happen. And we start to build today what we were dreaming about for tomorrow. So I want to tell you today, what you have is enough. Your money, your time, your talents, your skills, your leadership, your voice, your testimony, your brush, your tools. It is enough if you are willing to give it to God to be used for His glory. So I want to encourage you to live an open-handed life. And if you are part of Grace and you're still just a spectator, I want to tell you that it's time to leave your comfort zone. You can sit here forever and just remain a spectator, or you can say, God, I'm going to throw away the scarcity mindset. I'm going to step up. I'm going to participate in this beautiful mission that Jesus has called us to live. It's time for each of us to quiet down and say, God, what do you want me to bring to the table? And if you are new to Grace, or you've been at Grace a long time and you're still not sure how you can plug in or how you can contribute to what God is doing here, it's easy. We want you to take a next step. So we created some next steps for you. We call them next steps classes. It's simple, right? And step 1 is we talk about who we are as a church. Step into church every first Sunday of the month. Come and find out who we are and decide whether you're in or not. Step 2 is step into place, where we help you to discover your own gifts, your own talents, your own passions, and say, how does that plug in so that you can be part of what God is doing through this church and this community? Step 3, every third Sunday of the month, we've got step into faith. If you're still uncertain about Jesus, there is a beautiful future waiting for you with Him. And we tell you about what that means, what His grace is truly about. And step 4, the one we're going to be talking about today, is we want to help you to be able to walk with God as Moses walked with God. And you can only do that when you have some good spiritual growth habits in your life. So we're going to help you to figure out how to read your Bible effectively, how to pray, how to share. So that is happening, that 4th class, after the service. So if you're still unsure, just go to them. But start somewhere and make a decision to not live like this, but to start opening your hand. Let's pray. Jesus, it's so easy for us to believe that we're not enough. Or to believe that I will not be valued. Or to believe that my contribution cannot really make a difference. It's so easy for us to remain stuck in fear or in comfort. Now I want to pray today for each person listening to this message. I pray, Jesus, that in you, we will see that you ask of us only what we have, and that what you have entrusted to us is enough. I pray that we will open our hearts, that we will open our hands, and that we will not just follow you metaphorically, but that we will follow you with every inch of our being. Thank you for the amazing privilege that we have to be part of your church, to be part of the people that you've called to announce your freedom to this world. I pray that you will use us. I pray that you will multiply what you have given us and what we give back to you. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.